Welcome to Dad Gives Advice. My name is Orestes, and today I want to talk about another one of those books that I think everyone should read. This one is called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. I first came across it in the early 2010s, and this is definitely one of the things I wish I'd learned a long time ago because it was the first time that I really understood evolution by natural selection. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about evolution and a lot of really smart people that give some examples that's kind of off the cuff, and a lot of them are just incorrect or just plain wrong. And it's really because there's a basic misunderstanding about evolution that boils down to people thinking in terms of it being a directed process, or it being from the point of view of the animal or the group of animals wanting to improve their lot in life and wanting to be more and more perfect with every generation. Nothing could be farther from the truth, and Dawkins explains this very eloquently in his book. One of the first things to mention is that the book should not be read by title alone. Dawkins himself mentions this in the foreword, where he talks about people only looking at the book from the title itself and thinking it's a book about selfishness and about how it might be okay to be a selfish individual because, hey, after all, we're all made from genes and DNA, and if the DNA itself is selfish, the genes are selfish, then heck, people can be selfish too, and it's okay because it's the natural order of things. And that's completely the opposite of his message, and not the point he's trying to get across at all. The reason why he titled the book The Selfish Gene is that he wanted to write a book about evolution and explain evolution from the gene's eye view, or from the gene's perspective. And that twist that he put on it really made a huge difference in helping to explain how it is that genetics works, and how it is that inheritance works, and how it is that evolution actually works, as opposed to talking about it from the perspective of the individual or the group. The title that includes the word selfish does not necessarily mean that the individual that is built by those selfish genes, whether that individual is a crab, a tree, or a human, has to be selfish. We all know that altruism can emerge from individuals that are either working to cooperate with one another or working to help each other out. Almost everyone, of course, would find it reasonable for example, an adult to sacrifice his life if it were to save the life of a child, especially if that child was related to them. And that is the ultimate altruistic behavior, even though the genes themselves that built that adult may have been selfish. The book could have easily been called The Immortal Gene, or something like Selfish Genes That Build Cooperative Organisms. One of the reasons I think this book is so important is, again, it helps drive the message that evolution works at the gene level and not at the individual level. And that's something that a lot of people miss when they learn about evolution, either in high school or college, or sometimes you just hear about it. You hear examples quoted by people, and some of these people that really should know better, that smart people with PhDs quote poor examples, like saying things like, an animal strives to improve its lot in life, or it strives to a level of perfection, as if that was the goal. And when you look at it from a gene's perspective, it's really all about the genes trying to drive themselves into a future generation, competing against one another within a body, and then driving the organism to compete against other organisms and to try to reproduce them and live on into future generations. The classic example of an incorrect interpretation of evolution is the old story about the giraffe. It used to be, before people knew how evolution worked, the thought was, well, a giraffe got its long neck because it stretched its neck. At some point in the way back in history, giraffes had shorter necks, and one or two, or some of them in a group, started stretching their necks to reach the higher and higher branches, which might have had more nutrition or allowed them to feed more than other giraffes that didn't do that behavior and didn't get as much nutrition. And so the way the story goes, of course, is that those giraffes that kept stretching their necks actually grew longer necks, and as a result were able to pass on that trait to their offspring, and they were born with longer necks, which allowed them to feed on the higher branches and be more successful in reproduction. Of course, this is completely wrong. There's no way that you can have an animal do something that will affect that animal's offspring. The offspring are completely affected by the genes and the DNA that the parents use to build the offspring. Of course, when these theories were put together, people didn't know about DNA or genes. The giraffe story is kind of like me saying, if I lift a lot of weights and build big muscles before I have any children, then my children will be born with big muscles. And when they grow up, they'll just have big muscles without doing any of the heavy lifting. just doesn't work that way. Dawkins points out, of course, that the old giraffe story is all wrong. It's not that the animals are doing what they need to do in order to grow longer necks throughout the following generations. It's that the trees, the height of the trees and the height of the best branches and the best available food source and the most nutritious food source is at an elevation where only the very tallest giraffes are actually able to get to the best sources of food. And those taller giraffes, and it may have started with an animal that maybe had the neck the size of a horse, and even if some of them only had like a 1 inch taller neck versus the rest, they had a slight advantage, and that slight advantage gave them the ability to feed more or the ability to get to more nutritious shoots at the tops of trees. That then gave them an advantage when it came time to reproduce. They were able to have more offspring versus the other giraffes that might have shorter necks that were feeding on less nutritious leaves, or maybe fewer leaves because there were fewer available where they could reach. And as a result, over the generations, you've got taller giraffes being more successful in reproduction. Maybe in a group, the taller ones are able to have more offspring, maybe let's say 5 or 6 or 7, versus the smaller ones maybe having 0 or 1 or 2 at most. As a result, as the generations go by, you can see that the trait of being taller or having a taller and taller neck gets passed on to the more successful giraffes, and their offspring that are taller will end up having the same benefit and will end up having the same advantage. And so they then go on to continue to produce giraffes with longer and longer necks until you get to the point where you have the giraffe that we have today, which has a very long neck. Of course, this cannot go on forever. You can't have a giraffe with a mile-long neck because that's too dangerous. That giraffe would just not survive in the wild because it would be too unwieldy. It couldn't get around. It would be too slow. It would die. It would break its neck constantly. So evolution does this by a selection pressure. It drives the growth of these necks over the generations in order to get sort of an optimal level of nutrition. But if the giraffes that come out of a generation end up being too tall and that neck becomes a hindrance, then those giraffes with a too tall a neck actually don't survive or don't make it to reproduction, and they don't have offspring. And so you end up with a balancing out of a neck tall enough to get to the best branches and get the best nutrition, but not too tall for it to be a hindrance to the organism. Dawkins explains all this with care, and he uses lots of examples from lots of different animals and plants and insects and all kinds of organisms from the animal kingdom, and he does it really eloquently. He's got a great writing style. He's one of the rare authors out there who is a great scientist. He's one of the leading minds in biological sciences and also a great writer. So it's a really good combination and makes for a very entertaining read. The essential thesis of the book is that from a gene's perspective, or from a gene's eye view, nature is the one that's in the driver's seat, and these genes are essentially building what he calls survival machines. He calls our bodies, or the bodies of any organism or plant or anything like that, survival machines for the genes themselves to be able to copy themselves and propagate indefinitely into future generations. So in a way, it's almost like he even mentions it, even in, I think in the foreword, he talks about wanting people to envision this kind of like as a science fiction story, but with a lot of fact in it, right? And the science fiction part of it is sort of the analogy of these genes living on almost indefinitely or almost forever, because what they're doing is that they are building survival machines and then moving into the next generation of survival machines so that the genes themselves stay pretty stable throughout time. And that's exactly what happens within DNA. Genes are very, very stable over very long periods of time, up to even millions of years. And in a sense, these genes have a kind of immortality that, organisms don't, because organisms die, but the genes themselves seems to go on forever. That's why the book could actually have been called The Immortal Gene. Another myth that Dawkins dispels about evolution is that organisms are trying to get to some level of perfection, as if, blue jays were trying to reach some kind of perfect blue jay nests, or humans were trying to get to some perfect level of humanity as time goes by. And this is simply not the case, as we should be understanding by this point. The point is that the genes are actually building the body or the survival machine to best suit the environment. And those that are not best suited for the environment, those bodies that are not best suited for the environment, will just die and not reproduce, or reproduce fewer offspring than those that are better suited for the environment. And you see how that works is that the environment itself is the one that's driving the optimal behavior and optimal bodies that are being built by the genes. So in a population where some bodies or some individuals are better at surviving than others, whether that means evading predators or being a better predator themselves, or finding lodging, finding food, and all the kinds of things that go into doing well in your environment and being best at reproduction, being best at being able to copy yourself and drive those genes into the future, then those are the ones that are going to survive, and those are the ones that are going to fit best into whatever ecological niche they happen to find themselves in. And the ones that can't do that are not going to survive, and those are the ones that are not going to reproduce. So it's kind of a self-feedback loop kind of thing, that success breeds success within a particular environment. And that's why, people talk about, just as an aside, people talk about how ecological niches are important and species diversification is important, because you've got a very fine-tuned system there where an individual or a species is going to be very fine-tuned to its environment. And if we kind of change the environment too much and fiddle with it, as sometimes humans tend to do, then we might end up inadvertently wiping out species because we do it too quickly. Species cannot react to environmental change over the span of just a few years or a few decades. Evolution takes place over the span of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years or more. And so this is one of the reasons why, and this is another reason why it's important to read and understand this book, is our impact as humans on the ecosystem actually drives a big change in the potential for other organisms to survive and thrive. I'll give you an example from the animal kingdom. So a cheetah was driven to be the fastest animal in the world, not because it thought it needed to be faster than all the other animals, or it was striving to be the fastest. No, it was driven by the environment and by its prey. Its prey, being a gazelle, was almost as fast. So only the fastest cheetahs were able to catch gazelles and feed and reproduce. And that resulted in the fastest cheetahs giving birth to fast cheetahs, and so on and so forth, until you got to a point where almost every cheetah born is now faster than the gazelle and the fastest land animal there is. If by any chance a slow cheetah is born, they're not going to survive. They're not going to make it, and they won't live to reproduce. And you see how that feedback loop goes on and on. On the other side of it, gazelles had a selection pressure to try to evade cheetahs during the hunt. And so if you've seen videos of cheetahs chasing gazelles, you'll see gazelles that do a lot of fast lateral motions called juking. They'll try to evade cheetahs by making these quick changes of direction, which the cheetahs can't seem to make as well. And so the gazelles that are able to survive and pass on their genes are the ones that are able to evade the cheetah in the most effective way. And on top of that, you add camouflage. You see gazelles developed certain stripes on their hides that help them be camouflaged when they're in a large group together or when they're kind of hidden in the grass out on the savanna. The ones that develop the best camouflage are the ones that survive to pass on their genes to the future generations, and they pass on those same stripes, while the ones that didn't develop those things are easier to spot. They're eaten, and they can't pass on those camouflage little details that you see. So that's the beauty of how evolution works from both a prey and a predator perspective. The Selfish Gene was first published in 1976 after Dawkins had developed this idea of telling the story from a gene's perspective. It was later updated in the 1980s, but even though it's, you might think it's another old book that Orestes is recommending here. Even though it's older, it's an older book, it really stands up, and it's really an important book in the history of telling the story of evolution. And that's why I think it should be read by all humans. You might be surprised to learn that towards the end of the book, Dawkins introduces the concept of memes. And he does this for the first time. He was the one that coined the term meme. Now, these are not the memes that you see today on the internet that are funny pictures with funny captions. He's referring to memes as a way of describing how certain species like humans pass on technology, information, and other facts to future generations through teaching. So, for example, we learned about fire and then we passed that on from one generation to the next so that we kept the idea of fire going because it was such a useful invention. That was one meme. Language itself is another meme. And there's other technologies, of course, like that we pass on from one generation to the next. And that's not just exclusive to humans. Other animals do that too. Birds have nests and they pass on the building of nests, which are shelter, onto future generations. Beavers have dams. There's all kinds of examples that he cites in the book about this meme idea. And of course, the analogy to gene is that memes are examples of organisms passing on technologies and ideas to help them survive and help the genes move to the next generation. Well, genes are the unit of selection within bodies that are building the survival machines to drive themselves into future generations. So you've got genes doing the work from a physical perspective and memes doing work from a technological, spoken or verbal perspective or learning perspective. In the final chapter, the author summarizes the concept of the extended phenotype, which is the idea of animals building structures outside of their bodies. So from his point of view, he's saying that genes are not only building survival machines, but they're also building extensions beyond the actual organism to help propel themselves into the future generation. These are things like nests, beaver dams, buildings, homes, all kinds of things that organisms build and put together in order to help themselves reproduce and move those genes on to future generations. So that's The Selfish Gene. I think, like I said, every human should read it in order to understand what revolution is really about and to avoid those pitfalls of thinking it in terms of a directed process or in terms of an animal actively doing something to think about, improving their lot in life or striving to some level of perfection. It is, as we've seen, not that. It is about nature itself shaping the body through the genes, and the genes themselves building those survival machines in order to drive themselves indefinitely into future generations, even to thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Let me know if you like the book and if you have any questions or comments. And also, if there's any other books that you think everyone should read, let me know. I'll tell you if I've read it, and if I haven't, I will read it and give you a review here. Other than that, thanks for watching and have a nice day.